Okay, hi everybody, and welcome to Virtually Golden. Thanks for joining us today. My name's Annie. I work with Golden United. A couple of quick housekeeping things. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to dive in and ask them. You'll just need to click the unmute button, which is the bottom left corner of your screen. Ask your question and then click the mute button again so that we don't have any background noise. Other than that, feel free to use the chat function if you want to put your questions in that way. Or if you have any questions for me, you can enter them in the chat as well. Thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kathy Smith to do the introduction for our presenter today.
Hi, everyone. Happy to present Barb Warden, who's going to be giving us her last presentation in her Golden History session. I'm sorry to see the series end, but she's going to be taking us from World War II to our present historic times. Barb runs the website goldentoday.com and is the author of the daily email, What's Happening in Golden, which if you are not signed up, please sign up. It's wonderful. For her work with that site, she's received the Golden Chambers Civic Award, the Golden Mayor's Award, and the Golden Landmark Association's Living Landmarks Award. She is also past president of Leadership Golden and one of the founders of Golden Beer Talks. Barb is the author of 3 books about Golden, including Funiculars of Golden. She teaches a Golden history class through OLLI and is a frequent guest lecturer and tour guide on Golden history topics. Take it away, Barb.
Well, thank you, Kathy. Okay, as Kathy said, this is the 4th and final Golden History lecture, and this is the end of history as we know it. And we are now in the 21st century. In the first lecture, I talked about the gold rush. I talked about up the time from when gold was discovered in Colorado up until the railroad came and changed everything for Golden and enabled us to have more people and more industry and get goods and services and people in and out efficiently. Then in the 3rd lecture, I talked about the first half of the 20th century, which included World War I and World War II and the Depression and the 1918 influenza epidemic. And now I'm going to talk about what happened after World War II. I left us at the end of the last lecture talking about the GI Bill and how it changed Golden forever because it suddenly made college available to a much bigger group of people, and they all decided to come to the Colorado School of Mines, and we had a population explosion in Golden. So in the 1940s, up through the 1940s, our boundaries were basically the same as they were in 1860. It was everything was very close to downtown. Our population was about 1,200 people. And let's see, by 1950, well, I was wrong about the 1,200. We had grown from about 3,000 to over 5,000 people. And so that was a 65% growth in 10 years. And that was quite a shock to this little town. In the 1950s, we started to annex property. So first we went a little bit to the north of the historic downtown area and a little bit to the south. So we're into the East Street neighborhood and the beginnings of the area along Ford and Washington Avenue. And so mines was a big reason that we had this population explosion. The Federal Center was another reason, because the Federal Center had been the Remington Arms Factory during World War II, and the ground was reallotted to be used for some big government agencies, including the USGS and the Bureau of Reclamation, and some others. In addition, there was just huge pent-up demand for housing because materials to build anything had been very scarce during the war. And so suddenly people had the ability to build houses, and they wanted to. So during the 1950s, Golden was a very thriving town. I've talked to people who were teenagers here during the 50s. They describe it as it was thriving and it was fun. And I have a friend who talked about what it was like to be a teenager here. She said that the big pastime was driving up and down Washington Avenue. You would drive, and you know, Washington Avenue wasn't that long at the time. You would drive one way and you would get to the other side of the creek and you would turn around and you would drive the other way. And so you'd be sitting there in a car full of girls and you would pass a car full of boys. And, you know, it was the usual talk about, ooh, did he laugh? Did he wave? Did he smile? Stuff like that. And she called that dragging the gut, which is a phrase I hadn't heard before, but basically just going up and down Washington Avenue, being a teenager. During the 50s, there was a lot of tie-in with the School of Mines. When Mines had a football game, the businesses would close down for the duration of the football game because the whole town went there. In 1951, RTD, it wasn't called that at the time, but the tramway company discontinued having interurban service to Golden and to everywhere else. They discontinued all the streetcars and interurbans and tramways and decided that they would offer bus service, but basically the world was becoming very auto-centric. So that was a sort of sad thing that happened in the early 50s. But an interesting thing about Golden was that it was very self-contained. Golden was the shopping center for not only people who lived in Golden, but a big area around us because there was still a lot of ranching and farming in the area around Golden. And so if you looked at the stores that were there in the 1950s, we had multiple grocery stores. We had the big one, Safeway, but we also had a number of small grocery stores like this Evans Grocery and Golden Gate Market, and there were many others. We had 2 hardware stores at the time. There was Myers and there was Kellogg's Hardware. We had 3 department stores. There was Gamble's and Hested's and Eakers. We had car dealerships right there on Ford Street, so very close to downtown. We had a theater, we had a shoe shop, we had a men's clothing store and a women's clothing store, and we could even bury you at the end. We had Woods Mortuary right here on Washington Avenue. So Golden was very self-contained. It was the town for people who lived around here to do their shopping. Another less desirable thing that was going on in the 1950s and all the time before was that Clear Creek had become very polluted over time. I talked in the, second lecture about how Golden had had a lot of industry. We had a lot of smelters along Clear Creek and other industries. And at that time, it was just common practice to throw all of your waste products into the creek, because then they would be conveniently carried away. And it was not only Golden who was throwing things into the creek, it was the towns upstream, including the mining towns. And there was a drainage system so that all the mines drained down through Idaho Springs, and all the mining water was dumped into Clear Creek. And that made Clear Creek terribly polluted. And it may not be the worst thing, but it was certainly the grossest thing. Everybody was still throwing their raw sewage into the creek. That's how Golden's sewer system ended. We had a sewer system, carried the waste away from all the houses, and then it dumped it into the creek. We didn't start treating our sewage until 1956. So after World War II, the world was psychologically very changed. We wanted to not be Victorian. We wanted to not be old-fashioned. This was the atomic age, and we all wanted to be modern and streamlined and just nothing like those years that we had gone through before World War II. And so we began looking at all of our old buildings and deciding they were just remnants of the past and should be gotten rid of. There was also a factor of they weren't big enough because we had this big population explosion, and they didn't have parking because we had not needed parking until automobiles came along and started to really explode in the post-World War II era. So we had a beautiful courthouse on Washington Avenue, right across the street from what is now Foothills Art Center. You can see Castle Rock behind it. And we knocked that down in 1953. That's what's there now, across the street from Foothills. We had a number of historic churches. The one on the left there is the Historic Baptist Church that had been built in 1865, and that was replaced in the 1960s by the Baptist Church we now see at 19th and Washington. And that building there, which contains Tributary Food Hall, is what's in the spot that used to have that Historic Baptist Church. We had a Methodist church, and that moved over onto Ford Street. Well, it's between Ford and Jackson at 15th Street. That's the one that's just north of Safeway. And the Methodist church is now part of the Table Mountain Inn. It was right on this corner. The Catholic church, the Catholics moved out to the new Catholic church near the cemetery. The Presbyterians moved out to that church that's kind of diagonally across from Taco Bell in 1958, and that one turned into Foothills Art Center. Calvary Church is still there, and it's still being used as Calvary Church. But after many, many buildings were knocked down in this frenzy to modernize and get parking and all that, one of the last ones in the series that was slated to be turned into parking was the Astor House. The Astor House had been built in 1867, and it had been used for various things, hotel, and for most of the last 100 years, it had been serving as a rooming house, especially for School of Mines students. And that was slated to become a parking lot, and that's really what kicked off the preservation movement in Golden. People were really tired and heartsick at seeing all the old buildings being torn down, and they decided they were going to make a stand for the Astor House. And this is when the Golden Landmarks Association was formed, and they were formed particularly to save the Astor House, which through a vote of the people, they succeeded in doing, and so it's now a city asset, and it's been used as a museum since 1970, although the last few years it's been closed down. But that movement to start preserving things went from the Astor House to being the catalyst for establishing the 12th Street Historic District. And once that was established, people started to treat the houses in that neighborhood differently. A lot of them had been subdivided into student housing, and people began to think, well, I have a fine historic building. And they, over time, over like 30 years, they began to turn them back into single family homes and sort of split them up. And now the 12th Street Historic District is kind of a fancy neighborhood. It didn't used to be. When I moved here 30 some years ago, it was a little less nice than it is now. But now it's magnificent. That led to establishing another historic district on the north side of the creek, the 8th and 9th Street Historic District. And eventually we got an East Street Historic District. In the meantime, population continued to grow. We started doing a lot of annexing. I said that in the 50s, we annexed just north and south of the historic downtown. But in the 60s, we began to add other areas. This 60s area is like Peary Parkway, the area closer to the mountain. This is Beverly Heights over here. We began to go creeping down Old Golden or South Golden Road into the King Supers area. And our population continued to rise. We are now over 15,000. No, let me guess there. Over 7,500 in the 60s. One of the reasons we could be expanding so much is because everybody had cars, and then they had more cars, and they had more cars, and there were 2 cars per family, and then there might be more cars per family. And so we were becoming a very mobile society. We could live farther from downtown, and everywhere that was built, now we needed parking. The 70s, we continued to annex, we continued to expand, and our population continued to go up. And the 80s, it went up still more. This area up in the north is probably Mesa Meadows, in that part of town. The areas around Shelton Elementary began to grow. And you may wonder why we had this big blank spot in the middle of town. Why wasn't it all just contiguous? And that's because that is state land. That's the industrial school, the Lookout Mountain School for Boys. And that was something that was driving Golden absolutely wild, that we had all of that land that we couldn't build on because we were very into building and growing and annexing at that time, and put a lot of pressure on the state to try and let some of that go and return it to public use. And eventually they did let some of it go, and that's now Fossil Choice Golf Course. So the population was growing a lot, but our business community was not thriving. In the 1980s, people's shopping patterns changed, and they didn't really want to shop at a traditional historic downtown anymore. They wanted to go to Villa Italia and West, what was it called? There was a shopping mall along Colfax too, and that is the way people wanted to shop. And they didn't have parking problems, as you can see. They were very, very parking centric. They had massive parking lots. And that was very hard on our downtown. So one after another, the stores in our historic downtown began to close. I believe the reflection here is Foss Drug in the background. So this is a picture of Ested's department store across the street from it when it was vacant and for rent. We had a furniture store, and that went out of business. This is Eaker's department store, which went out of business. That is now the event center for the Buffalo Rose. Shotgun Annie's was the bar for the Buffalo Rose, and the first thing to come to a gold rush town was saloons, and the last things to ever go out of business is the bars. And so Shotgun Annie's was still thriving. But we had a real problem with our downtown, and so we took it in hand that we were going to fix this somehow. We were going to go against the grain of what was happening all over the country, where historic downtowns were dying, and we formed an urban renewal authority. And the Golden Civic Foundation had money for trying to revitalize downtown. And so they were also a partner with the Urban Renewal Authority. And the Chamber of Commerce also worked very hard to get downtown to be thriving again. They all had different roles. Civic Foundation bought some of the buildings that were standing vacant, including our hotel, which had been the Holland House, and it was standing vacant. They bought the buildings, and they selectively found developers that they thought could do a good job of revitalizing those properties. So they bought the Holland House. They found somebody who would turn it into what is now the Table Mountain Inn. And they did the same with some other properties. The Chamber's role was to put on events. And so beginning in the early 90s, the Chamber became an event engine, and that we had special events all the time downtown to draw people downtown. And you can still see that today. And some people feel we've gone a little too far in that direction, but we became just an event driven city. And it really helped to bring people in and to make people realize that Golden is a cool place. the Urban Renewal Authority did a lot of things to revitalize the infrastructure. One of the first things they did, I remember them doing this in the winter of '92, was to build the flower boxes downtown. And they did an amazing amount of sort of changing the attitude about downtown. It just, in one movement, made it a fancier, nicer place. It became an interesting thing to see what's growing in the flower boxes. And as you can see in that picture during one of our events, people use them to sit around and enjoy downtown. There's a picture of the Table Mountain Inn. That was another thing that they did in partnership with the Civic Foundation. They also did facade grants where they would contribute money to fixing up the front of your building. And so a lot of subtle things happened over a period of 15 or 20 years where you would just go downtown and think, oh, that building is prettier than I remembered it being. And it just happened one by one as the building owners were willing to put money into their buildings. And I think Gura paid about 50% of the price of upgrading the facades. Then the big thing that was everybody's moment of triumph was that the Hested's department store had stood there vacant for about 30 years. And that was very distressing to people who were trying to revitalize downtown and make us look like an economically thriving place. It sat there clearly not thriving. And finally, they were able to purchase that building and knock it down. And they found somebody who would redevelop that spot. And there was actually a public gathering with balloons and speakers and people there to celebrate the fact that this building was finally being knocked down and was going to be redeveloped. So that building that you see right there is Gateway Station, and that's the building that replaced the Hested's department store. We also began to have residences downtown. There had been a few old, kind of bedraggled apartments above the old commercial buildings, but we hadn't had a lot of residences downtown for many, many, many years. And they built the condos along Clear Creek. And we also cleaned up Clear Creek. It had been, as I said, in the 19th century, it became kind of an industrial sewer. And it became a Superfund site, beginning up in Idaho Springs, where all the mine water was draining into Clear Creek. Superfund site eventually established a water treatment plant up in Idaho Springs. And so the water quality became sharply better in the early 90s. And this is a before and after picture. This is a picture taken in about 1997 with my husband down on Clear Creek. In the background is the Colorado School of Mines Research Institute, which in itself was a source of some pollution because they worked on a lot of things, including radium there, and those things leached into the creek. And here's a picture taken in the 1990s. No, this is a picture taken in 2015 or so of the same spot with the same husband standing there. He no longer has the baby under his arms because she's in her 20s now. And we were able to turn what had been industrial byproducts and raw sewage into a kayak park. And so now it's a focal point and it's a recreation area, and it's just a real amenity to the town. During that era of suddenly making Golden a fancier place, we also built a golf course because we finally got some of that state land away from the industrial school, and built a water park and established a tourism program, which is, it had various names through the years, but it is now called Visit Golden. And that brought in lots of people. So here we have tourists enjoying our beautiful creek, which had not been usable at all before. And at times, some people might say that we've been too successful in our attempt to revitalize and attract people to our creek. Sometimes it's a mob scene down there. But here we are with a picture of downtown being not only more attractive and attracting lots of visitors, attracting residents as well. And not only the residents in the downtown area, but residents in the outlying areas in the neighborhoods. So here we are back to the map and the population. And through the 1990s, we continued to expand and we continued to annex, and these pink areas are what came in the 1990s. That would probably be Stonebridge over there. And don't remember the names, but the Canyon something area up here. And at that point, these were built on higher ground and they were more visible from downtown. And people had been sort of chafing under the amount of growing we were doing and feeling like it's not our small town anymore, and feeling unhappy. But then when they built those neighborhoods in particular that were higher and that were visible from everywhere, that really just was kind of a last straw for a lot of people. They felt like they were being intruded upon and they were having their mountain views spoiled. And so in 1995, I believe it was, by a citizen initiative, they put out a petition asking people if they wanted to put a growth limit in place, and people voted for it. And so as of the mid-90s, we had a 1% growth limit. We weren't going to grow any more than 1% of our current population, whatever that is. And so obviously over time, the growth gets bigger and bigger and bigger, but 1% felt like better than the unbridled growth we had had before that time. It didn't have the immediate effect of calming things down that people had hoped it would have. Our population continued to grow because we were controlling households, not population. And, you know, every household probably had 2 or 3 people in it, but the population continued to grow. And it continued to grow. And I guess the last time I had an update for it in 2014, we were over 20,000. Our current census that's underway is certainly going to show we're over 20,000 in Golden now. And there are consequences that come with that. We have traffic now that we didn't used to have. This is Ford Street, which is not exactly, you know, I-25 at rush hour, but it's a shock to the people who live there who had never, ever had to wait on Ford Street. And now we have traffic jams of a sort on Ford Street. We've become so popular that developers are coming in and scraping off old houses. This is on Ford Street, where there used to be a house up by the street and a small house back from the street, and now we've got townhouses there. And the new developments are much bigger than the old developments. This is another example of a scrape off where clearly we used to have a view here of Mount Zion, and that's now being blocked by new development. And we're building houses between our houses. We've got ADUs built along our alleys. And so we're building more and more densely. And people have differing opinions about this. Some people think density is great. Other people think that it's psychologically hard to have more people in a smaller area. And again, we've got downtown growth, and that's blocking views that we will never see again, because now there are tall buildings blocking the views. We've got the field across the street from Safeway, which was, you know, no great shakes. It was just an empty lot, but we used to be able to see Mount Zion as we walked away from Safeway, and now we're going to see a very tall building. So we're getting more height, more density, and that's starting to irk people. So in the 19th century, if you've listened to all of these lectures, we were worried about being just a gold rush town that was gone with the wind. We were worried about disappearing. In the 20th century, we were worried about our economy. We were worried about becoming just a bedroom community and losing our economic base. And now we're in 2020. We are thriving. We're vastly popular with tourists. We're adorable. We're cute as a button. And so, you know, we've got the question of this era, which is, are we there yet? Are we successful? Have we achieved what we wanted? And I think there is a community conversation going on about what is success? Is success having more and more and more people living here or not? Are we there yet? Are we successful? And interestingly, has the answer changed in the last month since coronavirus set in? Because from being a very, very economically viable town, we're suddenly very worried about our businesses, and we're establishing loan programs and various relief programs. And I think people really don't know what's going to happen next. So that's where we are in 2020 with big question marks. And we are now at the end of history. So if there are any questions, I would be happy to entertain them.
Okay, if you have any questions for Barb, just the unmute button, which is going to be at the bottom left corner of your screen. Dive in, ask your question, and then you'll click the mute button again whenever you're done.
Barb, do you have much information about the Federal Center and how it impacted growth in Golden?
Well, no, I can't say I've done a study of the Federal Center, but it went from being a big manufacturing facility during the war and bringing a lot of people here to Golden who were living here because the area around the Federal Center wasn't very built up. So this might be the closest accommodations available. And then the ground did not go back to being fallow or being rangeland after the war. A lot of federal agencies moved in there, and so it's still a big employer. And so it affects our population. I know a lot of people who work for the USGS, but beyond that, no, I can't say a lot. Any other questions?
Okay.
What about Taj Mahal and RTD and how that's impacted Golden?
Well, the Taj Mahal was built, I showed that early courthouse that was built in the 1870s. They built the next courthouse across the street from that in what's now a gigantic parking lot for mines because they needed more space and they needed more parking. And they outgrew that in the 1990s and they moved to that new location. And so that had some immediate effects in that people were pretty irritated that our county commissioners thought they needed such a big, expensive, fancy place. And that's why it's called the Taj Mahal. So the county commissioners who had voted to build that place were all voted out. And for the first time, maybe ever, Jefferson County had Democratic county commissioners, but that only lasted for one term and then they went back to being Republican again. It affected our downtown in that we no longer had people doing county business coming into downtown. And I think there was a second half to that question, but I've forgotten what it was. Oh yeah, RTD. Yeah, right. How has this affected us? I don't know. I think it has not affected us as much as people had hoped. They were hoping that having light rail here would immediately turn us back into mass transit using people. And it's not as used as people would like. That's not why they're cutting back on service right now, or even before the coronavirus. They're cutting back on service because employment was so high that they were having trouble employing drivers to do the driving. But a problem with mass transit is always, it has to be extremely convenient. And so it's a chicken and egg problem in that unless you have enough riders, it's not worth it to put more mass transit in place. And you won't have enough riders unless it's super convenient. So it's been hard to wean Americans from our cars, which are just inevitably more convenient than having to walk to a bus stop. So it has affected us, but not as much as people might like.
Okay, any more questions for Barb before we wrap it up today?
Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Awesome, wonderful. Thank you everybody for joining us today. We do have another session this Thursday, also at noon. Kathy, do you want to talk about who will be presenting this coming Thursday?
Yeah, Donna Anderson, who's a mines professor, is going to tell us about the 1889 white ash mine disaster in Golden, which I guess was a pretty big deal. So look forward to hearing about that. And thank you so much, Barb, for your series of 4 great history lessons about Golden.
And it's been my privilege.
Yeah. And if anybody wants to see Barb's presentations, all of them, or binge watch them, they're available on the goldenunited.org website, as are Paul Haseman's presentations and Tyson Noah's one about the Be Golden Fund. So thank you, everyone.
And thank you to Golden United.
We're so glad to have you, and we'll see you guys all here again on Thursday. Thanks so much, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Bye.